The jazz press made up its mind about Chet Baker before it had fully listened to him. The conclusion it reached, that he was a pretty face being marketed to an audience that confused attractiveness with talent, was not entirely wrong as a description of what Capitol Records was doing.
Chin
It
up
was
slightly.
entirely wrong as a description of what Baker
Good.
was.
Hold that right there.
The problem was that Baker refused to argue the point. He gave no interviews defending his musicianship. He made no statements about the condescension embedded in the criticism. He did not perform seriousness for an audience that was demanding it. He simply continued to play at the same level with the same quality of interior attention that had produced the recordings in the first place. And the recordings kept selling, and the critics kept writing, and Baker kept not responding. It took years for the jazz world to understand that the silence was not indifference. It was the most complete answer he could have given. The story begins in the summer of 1953, when a photographer named William Claxton walked into a Capitol Records studio in Los Angeles and spent an afternoon photographing a 23-year-old trumpet player who had recently signed with the label. Claxton was 24 years old and already developing the eye that would make him one of the defining photographers of the West Coast jazz scene. He had photographed musicians before. He understood how to find the image inside a performance, how to wait for the moment when a musician's face revealed something that the music was also revealing, the alignment of interior and exterior that produced a photograph worth keeping. The session had been arranged by Capitol's publicity department with the standard intentions of such sessions: promotional material, press photographs, the visual documentation that surrounded a new album release. Claxton had been given 2 hours and a brief that described Baker as a young trumpet player who also sang. He had not heard Baker's music before walking into the studio. He had not seen photographs. He arrived with his equipment and his professional expectations and encountered something that neither the brief nor his prior experience had prepared him for. Baker was not performing when Claxton photographed him. That was the first thing Claxton noticed. Most musicians, when a camera appeared, made some adjustment, a straightening of posture, a shift toward presentation, the small unconscious moves that people make when they know they are being observed. Baker made none of these adjustments. He stood or sat exactly as he had been standing or sitting and looked at the camera with the same expression he wore when he was looking at everything else, that quality of being completely present and completely interior simultaneously, as if the lens were a window he was looking through rather than a mirror he was performing for. Claxton took hundreds of photographs that afternoon. When he developed them and reviewed the contact sheets, he found the same thing in frame after frame, an image that looked less like a publicity photograph and more like a portrait made without the subject's knowledge, not because Baker was unaware of the camera, but because his awareness of it produced no change in what his face was doing. He was simply there, exactly as he was, in every frame. Claxton said later that in 20 years of photographing musicians he had encountered this quality perhaps 3 times. The camera, he said, can always tell when someone is performing for it. Baker was constitutionally incapable of performing for anything. Capitol Records selected the photograph that would become the cover of Chet Baker Sings, with a logic that was straightforwardly commercial. It was the most compelling image on the contact sheet, and it was compelling in a way that the label's marketing department believed would sell records to an audience that extended beyond the existing jazz market. The face in the photograph was extraordinary, in the way that certain faces are extraordinary, not through any single feature, but through a combination of structure and expression that produced something the camera found irresistible. The marketing department knew what they were looking at. They put it on the cover. What followed was not what they expected, or rather it was more than they expected and in a different direction. Chet Baker Sings sold. It sold in numbers that surprised everyone at the label, including the people who had believed in it enough to release it, and the people who had not believed in it enough to promote it properly. It sold to jazz audiences and to people who had never bought a jazz album. It sold in college towns and in cities and in the specific demographic of young women who had seen the cover photograph and whose interest in what was inside had been initiated by something other than a prior commitment to jazz as an art form. Within 3 months of release, the album had outsold every other debut vocal release Capitol had put out in 5 years. The radio play it received came not from jazz stations, which were cautious about it, but from the progressive FM stations that were beginning to develop an audience for music that did not fit existing categories. The audience that found it was not the audience the label had targeted. It was a broader and stranger audience, people who encountered the album in circumstances that had nothing to do with jazz marketing and who responded to it with an intensity that the label's promotional materials had not been designed to produce. The jazz press noticed the sales figures and drew conclusions. The conclusions were, almost without exception, unfavorable to Baker. The reviews and critical pieces from 1954 and 1955 follow a pattern that is striking in its consistency, an acknowledgement that the voice was doing something unusual, followed by a sustained argument that the commercial success of the album was primarily a function of the cover rather than the content. Baker was described in various formulations as a product of the Capitol Records publicity machine, as someone whose appeal was photogenic rather than musical, as a symptom of the music industry's willingness to subordinate artistic merit to visual marketing. The jazz world, which had always maintained a complicated relationship with commercial success, found in Baker's particular combination of extraordinary looks and extraordinary voice a target for anxieties that had been building for years. Dick Bock, Baker's producer at Capitol, read the reviews with the specific anger of a man who had been in the studio when the recordings were made and understood precisely what Baker was doing technically. He had watched Baker work, the preparation that looked like casualness, the harmonic understanding that the apparently simple delivery concealed, the breath control and resonance placement that vocal coaches had examined and been unable to fully explain. He knew that the criticism was not just unfair, but was operating on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the music actually contained. He wanted to respond publicly and told Baker he intended to. Baker told him not to. Bock argued. He said that the narrative the jazz press was constructing would follow Baker for years if it was not challenged at the beginning. That the window for correcting the record was open now and would close. That silence in the face of inaccurate criticism was not dignity, it was surrender. Baker listened to all of this. Then he said, "Let them write what they want. The music will say what needs to be said." Bock asked, "When will the music get to say it?" Baker picked up his trumpet. The silence that Baker maintained in the face of the critical response was not passive. It was, in its way, the most active choice available to him, because it redirected everything toward the only arena he trusted: the recordings themselves, the performances, the accumulated evidence of what he was actually doing when he played. He gave almost no interviews during this period, and the few he gave were notable for their brevity and their refusal to engage with the terms the critics had established. He did not describe himself as a serious musician in response to people who were questioning his seriousness. He did not explain the harmonic concepts underlying his arrangements. He did not perform intellectual credibility for an audience that was withholding it. What he did was make more records. The recordings he produced in the 2 years following the Chet Baker Sings controversy are, by the assessment of most jazz historians who have studied them seriously, among the most consistent work of his career. The instrumental albums he recorded during this period, with Russ Freeman, with Jerry Mulligan, with various European musicians, demonstrated a technical command and a harmonic sophistication that could not be attributed to photogenic quality. The critics who reviewed these albums found themselves in a position they had not anticipated. They were reviewing music that did not match the narrative they had established about its maker. The instrumental work was particularly difficult to dismiss. When Baker played trumpet without singing, without the voice that the critics had categorized as a commercial product, what emerged was something that demanded evaluation on purely musical grounds. The phrasing was distinctive in ways that required knowledge of bebop and post-bop harmonic language to fully appreciate. The tone had a quality that trumpet players who studied his technique described as the result of specific and sophisticated embouchure decisions, choices that a musician playing for commercial appeal rather than musical integrity would have no reason to make, because they were invisible to any listener who was not already technically informed. The music was, in other words, designed for people who knew what they were hearing. The cover photograph had been designed for people who did not. Baker was operating on both levels simultaneously, and the critics had only noticed one of them. Some of them revised the narrative. Most did not. At least not immediately, and not without a resistance that said more about the difficulty of publicly revising a critical position than about the quality of the music. The jazz press moved slowly, and it moved especially slowly when moving meant acknowledging that an earlier consensus had been wrong. Baker watched this process with the equanimity that characterized his response to most things that happened outside the music. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew him during this period, bitter about the critical treatment. He was not particularly interested in it in either direction. Russ Freeman, who spent more time with Baker during those years than almost anyone, said that Baker discussed the critical controversy approximately twice in the 2 years it was at its height. Once to say that the critics were responding to something other than the music, and once to say that this was the critics' problem rather than his. Both statements were delivered with the detachment of someone reporting on weather conditions in a city they were not visiting. Freeman found Baker's indifference to the controversy genuinely puzzling for a period. He was himself invested in Baker's reputation in the way that a producer and collaborator is invested in the reputation of someone whose work he has helped shape and believes in. The criticism stung him in ways it apparently did not sting Baker, and he could not initially understand the distinction. Eventually, he concluded that Baker's equanimity was not a performance of not caring. It was a genuine absence of the mechanism that would have made the criticism land. Baker simply did not have a strong attachment to how the jazz world categorized him. He had an extremely strong attachment to what happened when he played. Everything else was peripheral information. The photographer William Claxton, whose image had inadvertently initiated the controversy, watched its development with feelings that were more complicated than Baker's. Claxton understood photography, and he understood how images functioned in the context of commercial music, and he understood that the Capitol Records cover had activated something in the public and critical response to Baker that was difficult to separate from the response to the music. He did not believe this was his fault. The photograph was what it was, and it was what it was because Baker was what he was, and neither of those facts was a choice. But he was aware that the image had preceded the music in the public consciousness and had set terms that the music was then evaluated against rather than on its own. Years later, Claxton said that what had always struck him about the controversy was the degree to which Baker's response to it mirrored the quality of the music itself. The music was characterized by restraint, by what was not played, by the silence around the notes, by the refusal to fill every available space with sound. Baker's public response to the critical dismissal had the same structure. He withheld. He let the silence work. He trusted that what was absent would communicate as effectively as what was present, because that was what the music had always taught him. The critical reassessment came gradually over the course of a decade. By the mid-1960s, the reviews of Baker's work had changed in tone and in substance. Critics who had written about the cover photograph were now writing about the recordings with the attention they had initially withheld. The vocabulary had shifted from the language of commercial manipulation to the language of musical analysis, chord structures, modal approaches, the specific qualities of Baker's breath control, and the placement of his resonance. The music that had been present in 1954 was being heard, finally, on its own terms. Baker gave no interviews marking this development. He made no statements about the revision of the critical consensus. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say, "This is what I meant when I said the music would say what needed to be said." He simply continued to make records and play concerts and move through the world with the same quality of interior attention that William Claxton had photographed in a Capitol Records studio in 1953, present, unreachable, exactly as he was. The photograph that had started everything was still on the album cover. It had not changed. Baker had not changed. The music had not changed. The only thing that had changed was that the world had stopped looking at the cover long enough to listen to what was inside. And what was inside, it turned out, was exactly what the photograph had been trying to say all along. That here was a person for whom the interior and the exterior were not separate, for whom the face and the music were expressions of the same thing, and that the same quality that made the image extraordinary was the quality that made the sound extraordinary. The critics had been looking at the right thing. They had simply been looking at it wrong. If the story of what Chet Baker's silence communicated, and what it took the world a decade to hear, stayed with you. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that the most powerful response to being misunderstood is not argument, but continuation. The patient insistence of simply doing the work until the work speaks for itself. Have you ever been judged for the wrong reasons and chosen to let the work answer? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to explore more stories about the musicians who understood, earlier than most, that silence can be the most precise language available.